So is there anything in the Convention of States geared towards Congress, or is it just a constitutional Congress to rewrite or limit congressional powers that way?
It would be anything that would limit the freedom of Congress or the president or the courts or the administrative agencies to do whatever they want. This is what would be known, broadly speaking, as a limiting powers convention. So, for example, and I do agree with you, I think we need to specifically limit the congressional power, which is largely now granted and authorized by the courts. It's not in the Constitution, to delegate lawmaking authority to agencies. So, one thing that most people don't realize is when Congress passes a law and says, for example, they want to regulate the waters of the U.S., generally speaking, the statute itself is not comprehensive. There's always what's called an enabling clause in there, and it says something like the secretary of whatever department they're empowering, shall make such laws as further the desires of this act that we're passing. And so what that means is then you have the secretary of a particular cabinet department deciding what the rules and regulations should be. That secretary is unaccountable to the American people. In a lot of cases now, they're passing laws, they're serving as judge and jury, and then they decide on punishments. In my opinion, this is completely unconstitutional, and you could absolutely stop that process with a convention.
Got it. So one last point before we really dive in, and Eric, I know there's a couple things you want to bring up as well. So I know that in the next Supreme Court session, they're going to take on what we call the Chevron decision. Yeah. Right? And the Chevron decision, for those listening, is where the courts, it's an egregious, frankly, ruling, in my opinion. But the courts basically have left it up to, through the Chevron decision, to the administrative agencies, i.e. in the executive branch, to interpret and essentially what I would say is make law. So we'll see if what the Supreme Court does with that Chevron ruling, and that may, Mark, speak to exactly what I think what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'd love to jump in there for a second. I have to explain this a lot to folks. The Chevron doctrine actually said that and I'm going to give an extreme example, that if an agency passed a regulation that said that the sky is blue, and then later on they just made a decision saying, well, what that really means is that the sky is green, then you are bound by their interpretation. It's not required to be reasonable. It's great deference. It's called the Chevron deference doctrine. So it says that an agency has the right to interpret their own regulations, and it doesn't even have a requirement of reasonableness. Over the last couple of sessions, the Supreme Court has pared back Chevron deference, and there is a possibility that they're going to overturn this. What that does is it opens up a lane of litigation for private litigants and big companies, individuals, to challenge the regulatory scheme imposed on them and the interpretations imposed on them by the agencies. So I think this is an excellent pruning back of the administrative state.
I think if you could, Mark, just for a second, because so as much as we love to pick on lawyers, this is the benefit of your legal background. You explain reasonableness, okay? Because I don't think a lot of Americans understand that using the word reasonable person, things like that, when it comes to interpreting law or passing down judgment. Can you explain a little bit about why that word is so important and what it means?
Yeah, and there's a long history of what's called the reasonable man standard. And this goes back to common law in England. We brought this over to the colonies with us. It's the idea of just what would just a normal average person think this means. So in other words, I gave a ridiculous example that the agency says the sky is blue, and then later on they say the sky is green. And so if you, as a reasonable person, were to read the language, it says the sky is blue, then you would say, okay, well, they're trying to regulate the sky being blue. And when they come back and say the sky is green, well, no reasonable person would believe that. And what the courts had done with Chevron deference is said, well, it doesn't really matter what an average normal person would think. We're going to defer to the agency because the agency is the expert here. And what it really did effectively is it made it possible for these agencies to essentially do anything they wanted under any regulation, because the deference, the benefit of the doubt was provided to the agency, not to the reasonable person. The reasonable person standard is a very important standard in British common law, in American law, And in a lot of cases, we've abrogated that standard. We need to go back to that standard a lot more.
I would absolutely agree with that. That is just, sometimes I hear these court decisions, or I hear about these choices being made by the administrative state, what you might call the deep state, the administrative state, the unelected fourth branch of government. And you just go, how did we get here? This is absolutely outrageous. And I think that's why a convention of states is so attractive to the American people right now, and why I know you're seeing a lot of energy. I know Vermont has seen a huge increase in petition signers recently, the more they are unreasonable and kind of going off of the cliff.
Yeah, look, I think one of the reasons we see the increase in enthusiasm generally is, regardless of what party you belong to, what your sort of political ideology is, very few people believe that DC is running well. Very few people believe that DC isn't off the rails. And so you have this broad consensus in the American body politic that DC is out of control. It doesn't relate to the American people anymore. We can't relate to them, and that we need to take power away from them and give it back to the people. It's not a partisan issue. There's no actual policy contained in the idea of calling this convention of states. The prime idea in a convention of states, the one that we're proposing, is that there should be a debate in the United States of America about where the power resides, who makes the decisions. So we ask the question, who decides? The average American, left, right, and center, all say, I should decide about my own life, or if it has to be decided at a government level, maybe it's local, maybe it's state, but very few people would say, well, we love when the federal government decides for everybody.